computer. Here we go. Right. Hello, folks. Welcome again to another of my convention talks recycled for the pandemic. This time, I'm going to talk about something where you really wouldn't want to have a pandemic in here. It caused great problems. What I'm going to talk about are closed-loop life support systems. This was originally a talk written for one of the satellite conventions, but I've pulled it out and I've updated it a little bit. And at this point, I try to get it to, let's see, remote control. Nope, it's not working. Aha, got it. All right, so a little bit of background. Space is not a comfortable place to live. Some bacteria can handle it, but pretty much all terrestrial life forms suffer a bit of an existence failure if you put them into space unprotected. Now, unprotected is the important word here, because protection is one of the big three things that we need if we are going to deal with living in space. And those three things are protection from the environment, all the unpleasant stuff out there, provision of consumables, so the ability to generate food, water, oxygen, all the other stuff that we need as living creatures, and we have to deal with the removal of waste. Now, provided we've got these three basic elements, then we can survive in space fairly well. However, it won't be comfortable. It won't be comfortable, and it will cause all sorts of interesting reactions in our bodies in terms of physical reactions to the lack of gravity. So, although these three things form a minimal requirement set, if we want to be comfortable in space, we're going to have to add gravity as well. Now, in space, how are we going to add gravity? Generally rotation or very large bungees. If we are looking at a closed life support system on the moon or on Mars, that's less of an issue. We have gravity anyway. So actually the moon base is a little bit easier. So I'll look at those three things in turn. The first thing I'll start off with is environmental protection. What are we trying to protect against? We're really trying to stop being fried. We want to be in a low radiation environment. Now, here on Earth, we are fortunate that we have an atmosphere that stops some of the radiation. We have Van Allen belts. We have an ozone layer. Various things will stop some of the different forms of radiation come in towards us. In a low radiation environment, i.e. roughly where we are in the solar system, this is a relatively simple thing. You know, a large enough tin can will do it. We also need to protect ourselves against the vacuum of space. In other words, we want to keep air inside where we are. Now, we can live for short periods of time on a minimum 3 kilopascals of air pressure. But for long term, we're looking at 70 kilopascals with 21% of oxygen. What are we normally living with on the planet right now? About 100. So we can drop to about 0.7 atmospheres long term, which makes life a little bit easier. Of course, when we are flying in aircraft, we are going down to considerably below our normal 100 kPa. So this is one of the reasons we know 7 kPa is not a problem. Now, if we want to build this in space, we have to have something in which to put it. So a large enclosure. How large does the enclosure need to be? How big is our tin can? Well, it depends on the mission. For very short missions, like the lunar missions, or indeed Gagarin's first mission, it was very, very small. You were not looking at a lot of space. If you want people to live in space long term, you need to have at least 10 cubic meters per person after about 6 months. And in fact, as I look at that, I think it may be 10 meters, 10 by 10 by 10 rather than just 10 meters. You need a certain level of space. This is not just for physical requirements, this is for psychological requirements. Now, I'm not going to talk about the psychological issues of living in a closed-loop life support system. That would be a totally different talk. I'm really just going to look at the physical issues today. The final thing with this that we need to deal with is thermal regulation. Now, thermal regulation is how hot is it getting? How cold is it getting? We have to be really careful with that. The International Space Station has to be careful to have its radiators working, because if it's in direct sunlight, it can get very warm. If it's in the Earth's shadow, it can get very cold. So we have to have a heating system and a cooling system depending upon where we are in space. Now, if we are closer to the sun, then that is an even bigger problem because we'll get more incident radiation. If we're further away from the sun, we will be a lot cooler. But generally, we have to have a good thermal regulation system to go with this. That's what we need for a low radiation environment. If we're in medium radiation or high radiation environment, this is a lot more problematic. By problematic, I mean expensive. We can do it, but it requires much more shading, much more shielding. Now, how much is this shielding going to cost in terms of mass? Well, for local missions to the moon, it's not a problem. We don't need to worry about shielding because the missions are not long enough. Now, space itself is a relatively high radiation environment because we don't have the protective layers around that we do have around the Earth. If we're just going to the moon, it doesn't take long. If it's a short mission, we don't need to worry about it. If we were doing a 6-month mission to Mars, we'd need just over 2 tons per person. And if we were going to try something crazy like an interstellar mission, which would be really cool, but it would require 45 tons of shielding per person. 45 tons of shielding is a ruddy, great, big rocket. So it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And when we start looking at practical planning for Mars missions, it does assume prophylactic use of anti-radiation drugs, because we know that on a mission to Mars, the astronauts are going to suffer from a lot more radiation damage than they would here on Earth. So we have to do something about it. One thing that we can do about it is select our astronauts very, very carefully, because there is a genetic component to radiation sensitivity. And if we can identify that, then we can select astronauts who are not going to have as many problems with the impact of radiation. In practice, going to Mars, even with shielding, does mean coming back with a significantly higher likelihood of a whole variety of cancers once you've returned. So that looks at protection. What about our consumables? Well, there's been an awful lot of work done upon this, mainly due to studies, scientific studies, initially on Skylab, and then on Mir, and now on the ISS, and on the Chinese Celestial Palace station. So they really do know pretty well how much energy a human requires in space. And this is metabolic rate, heat of reaction, which are human-based measurements, but also the cost of power and heat in order to keep the environment comfortable. And this is, again, the equivalent of about 21 kilos per person per day. However, that is true consumables. It does not include water for washing, water for anything else. It's entirely water for drinking. It doesn't include weight for utensils, weight for clothing. It doesn't include any of these things. So water is a big issue. We need an awful lot of water for long-term spaceflight. And at present, we cheat. The International Space Station has regular resupply missions. And those resupply missions will produce an awful lot of stuff. They'll take it up, and the astronauts will pull the new stuff out and stick all the junk back in to send it back down to Earth. So resupplying a space station is actually quite an expensive proposition. Now, once we've got all of these extras like washing taken into account, mass per person per day works out at roughly, flush water is 0.5 kilo, solids 1.5, liquids 30 kilos, 0.8 kilos of gases, so roughly 31.5 kilos of stuff. That may not sound like very much, but remember that's all got to be hoisted out of the gravity well. And hoisting stuff out of the gravity well is expensive. Now, the assumption is that we're going to recycle as much of this as we can. Right now, the ISS recycles a lot, but it cannot recycle everything. If we're going to Mars, then we're really going to have to look at self-sufficiency in a much, much more focused manner. If we're building a base on the moon, it's easier than going to Mars, and we've also got the potential of the moon as a source for some of this material, particularly if we start looking down in the southern lunar craters where we have water. So depending upon where you place your base, on the moon or on Mars, you may not have to be totally self-sufficient, but certainly for travel and for bases in the near future, bases and stations in the near future, we need to aim for self-sufficiency. So what do we do with the stuff we cannot recycle? Well, the most efficient thing to do is to have your regeneration system such that whatever regenerates food also regenerates air, which is the biological approach. This is the idea of, really, folks, we want to grow things on our space stations. Now, this has been attempted in several environments, and the most famous of these is probably the Biosphere 2 one, where they built this beautiful big, it wasn't a dome, but it was a rather nice angular structure, and they put a bunch of astronauts in there, and they tried to make the whole thing organically self-sufficient. It didn't quite work. It proved that maintaining the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide was actually really very, very difficult. But they learned an awful lot about the process. Now, in the short term, this isn't practical. We still need to know a lot more about pure biological regenerative life support systems before we can even think of having a practical interplanetary or space station based biological life support system. So instead, we have to go for what we term a physicochemical approach. And this is the classic physics chemistry based rather than biology based system that we use at present. And the two main things that we look at with this are water regeneration and air revitalization. And water regeneration, we not only capture every single drop of waste that we can, but we also recapture water from the air. So you have vapor compression distillation and reverse osmosis, and that will capture and purify any vapor, any liquid water that it can find. If we want to revitalize the air, what we need to do is we need to take out the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is the real nasty. We have to do that in order to keep a lot stay alive. We need oxygen. It's not just a case of needing oxygen, it's also a case of removing the carbon dioxide. So we can do this using things like molecular sieves that only allow certain molecules into certain parts. We can use the Bosch carbon dioxide production system, and we have what's termed the static feed water electrolysis system. So this allows us to do conversions between water and oxygen, so for oxygen generation, which helps. So looking at some of these, BCD, the vapor compression and distillation, this is what we're going to use to extract water from liquids. I use the word liquids deliberately because we may say that any water that you drink from the Thames has been through at least 8 humans before you drink it. Well, with a space station, seriously, you are extracting from everything. The important thing is that you are not constantly reminded that liquid waste is being turned into water. Or at the very least, if you are, then you have to have a fairly solid stomach not to remember that every time. So what this does is it takes an evaporator, a condenser, and a condensate collector, sticks the whole thing in a rotated drum, and the reason for the rotating drum is that you can then generate a force, a microgravity force in effect, that lets you push the liquid that you have generated out through a pipe rather than just having it hanging there in 0G. And once it's in a pipe or into a storage pack, it can then be used for other things. Now, this is a really efficient way of doing things because we recover the latent heat of condensation for the evaporation, and the only energy we require is for compressing vapor and compensating for heat loss. So this is something that has been worked on throughout the space age, and we're really pretty good at that. What it does is it produces water. The thing that is produced, though, is water with stuff still in it. So there can be an awful lot of other interesting things in the liquid generated. So the reverse osmosis approach allows you to pass the water through a membrane due to osmosis, and the water will pass through, but the larger molecules will be left behind. So this gives you a much more, a much purer water at the far end. So it's quite a nice approach. How do we deal with air? Well, Molecular sieves are a two-stage process, and the first stage will take out the CO2, the second stage will recover any extra oxygen. Why do we need to do it as a two-stage like this? Because when we breathe out, we breathe oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we're never actually going to be able to just extract carbon dioxide entirely. We tend to take the gas in a gas stream, and it's just the standard air, if you like, in the spaceship. And we then split it into carbon dioxide and oxygen. The oxygen we can release straight off, but the CO2, we have to do other stuff with it. And we tend to use a zeolite to do this. And the way this works is a zeolite is a really cool, think of it as small pellets or dust. Think activated carbon. That's the type of approach. It's a material that captures molecules on its surface. So the molecules, as the gas passes over the zeolite, carbon dioxide will be pulled onto the surface of the zeolite itself, and then we can heat it or change the pressure at a later date, and that will extract the captured carbon dioxide, refreshing the zeolite itself so that the zeolite can be reused. So it's quite a useful approach. It means you extract the CO2 and you can refresh the materials used to do that. If you've got the carbon dioxide, then you can generate water with it. And this is the Bosch process. So the Bosch process allows you to take your CO2 and hydrogen and convert that to water and heat. Problem is, it does have to run at 800 to 1000 Kelvin, which is fairly warm. But they still use this system because it is very efficient, and it will produce carbon as a removable cartridge. So you have a machine that does this, and every now and again, like your photocopier, you have to change the cartridge. Unlike your photocopier, it's black stuff coming out, whereas with your photocopier, it's black stuff going in. But it means that you are compacting the waste to as small an amount as possible to then throw into your Dragon capsule, taking back to Earth for recycling. Once you've got water, you can then generate oxygen and hydrogen for it. Now, as you can probably imagine, we have here three processes that all interact with each other. You need carbon dioxide and hydrogen to generate water. With water, you can generate hydrogen and oxygen. So the balance between these processes has to be very carefully managed. But we have a good physical and chemical understanding of how to perform these particular processes. This is what a life support system would look like for something like a moon base. Now, this is a diagram for a regenerative system. So regenerative, great. This is what we're basically working with. We have the crew cabin in the middle, and our inputs to the cabin are food with water. And you notice that that is coming from outside. It's one of the very few things coming from outside entirely in its own right. But we also have to have clean air, potable water. These both come in. Water comes in at a couple of points. It has potable water for drinking. It also has water for hygiene purposes, this is not drinkable water. This is, in many cases, grey water. So it's not totally drinkable. The water is recycled through the core water recycling system down in the bottom. Now, where does this get water from? It gets the water from the hygiene system. It gets water from air, which is condensed out. It gets water from the VCD, which extracts it from things like urine, from brines, from the other elements in the water recycling system. So the water system generates a lot of water which can then be sent to the potable H2O reservoir. If you are saving energy, you don't need to make everything potable because, as I said, your hygiene-based water is grey water. So you can minimize your energy requirements by splitting those off into two processes. So you get water from core water recycling, goes into the potable H2O reservoir, and then it can be fed back into the cabin. So that deals with the water side. What about the air side? Well, clean air comes into the crew cabin at the top from the CO2 removal, CO2 reduction unit. Now, what this is doing is it's taking air in from the cabin crew, the crew cabin, and it is applying the CO2, the zeolite-based reduction approach. It's also getting stuff from electrolysis of water. It's also interacting with the water system, again, through the Bosch process. So you've got a second cycle, a second loop in this for the air. What happens with waste? Well, the most obvious waste is feces, of course. Urine can be recycled into water, and is. Feces aren't. Basically, what you do is you chuck them out the airlock. You can return them to Earth if you are medically inclined, but they are normally part of what is termed outboard waste. So you can just toss the whole thing out. Now, this is the chemical process. This is the physicochemical approach. This is entirely based on the physics and chemistry that we have learned through practice in 50 years of spaceflight. Fantastic. 50 years of, shall we say, medium length spaceflight. What happens if we look at the ISS itself? How does the ISS apply these things? Well, this is the diagram of the ECLSS, the Environmental Control and Life Support System for the International Space Station. Now, we've already said that the ISS is restocked regularly. So when it's restocked, stuff comes in from generally nowadays either on the one of the Russian ones or on the Dragons. So what systems do we have here? We have our crew compartment in the middle. We have temperature and humidity control. This manages the air. So it manages how much water is within the air, what's the temperature in the air. And this passes air onto CO2 removal. And the space station actually tends to end up with a bit too much CO2, so they vent it overboard. They also have it linked into the fire suppression system. So you can do brief bursts of CO2, but again, you have to be careful. Closed environment, as you can imagine, CO2 in a closed environment is a bit of an issue. The oxygen itself, we've got an oxygen generation process. As you can see, we have nitrogen kind of appears from nowhere. We have to take nitrogen up. We've got nitrogen in the atmosphere, but if we are venting things overboard, we do need to top up the nitrogen occasionally. Oxygen generation, we generate it if we vent hydrogen if we don't need it. The oxygen will generally come into the oxygen-nitrogen control. We need to make sure that we're keeping our 21% oxygen level, which is essential. Urine recovery in blue there goes into potable water processing, and water processing either goes to crew systems, so product water, we get wastewater back from there, which comes back into water processing, and water is used for oxygen generation. It's also pushed into the temperature and humidity control. And then finally, we have our orange. I'm going to call that orange rather than monkey ship wrap. We have a nice orange waste management, and waste management tends to be removed. So as you can see, the life support system isn't a single system. It's actually a group of interlocking and interreacting systems. Now, this is interreacting, interlinked purely as physical chemical systems. If we want to go for long-term life support, these physical chemical systems are very, very expensive. Why don't we then use biological systems? Because biological systems have some great, great advantages. First of all, they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and generate oxygen. Second, they generate food. You can eat them. So this gives them this double usefulness, which is really, really good. We can also use some of that human waste as fertilizer. Now, I know that there are issues using human waste as fertilizer. We do have to be quite careful with contamination and buildup of certain elements and biological content, so bugs. So this is something where we do have to be a little bit careful of, and we are working on this. Now, there are lots and lots of techniques that people have introduced. Hydroponics, people like hydroponics. You know, why do we want to have all the soil? Why do we want to lug soil around when we can just use the water? Well, it's a nice idea, doesn't quite work yet. Not with the closed loop that we need. So there are lots of techniques that people are looking at, but we're having problems creating truly self-sufficient environments. Now, the big experiment was Biosphere 2, and they tried really hard to make it entirely self-supporting. But in the end, they generated way too much carbon dioxide, so they needed extra CO2 scrubbers. They ran out of oxygen because they had too much CO2. They couldn't keep the balance right, so they actually ended up opening the windows, which was something they didn't want to do. Their solar panels didn't generate enough energy, so they had to use natural gas for energy, for electricity generation. Now, we can produce natural gas biologically. We can use bioreactors to generate not just methane, but a variety of other short chain hydrocarbons that can be used. But Again, we haven't really done a lot of this in space. They analysed what went wrong with Biosphere 2, and one of the conclusions they came to was that the soil bacteria that they had in the main growth medium was not appropriately balanced. Now, there's an awful lot of work can still be done on appropriate soil bacteria. This is another one of the reasons why hydroponics is quite popular as a concept, because you don't need to worry so much about soil bacteria. It may be that you have to sterilize soil and then reseed it with appropriate bacteria if you want to get a biological life support system working. And that's going to be expensive in its own right. So what other biological techniques are we going to use? Well, we've got enzyme bioreactors. Bioreactors are big. Bioreactors are cool. Pre-treating waste. You put your waste in, it bubbles away, and it can do things like turning inedible biomass into edible biomass. It can also produce substrates for other biological techniques. Now, the simplest approach to production of substrate for other biological techniques really is you take your waste and you spread it on your soil. But as I mentioned, that has issues, so it's better to run it through some enzymes first to get rid of the more unpleasant stuff. Generating things with microorganisms allows you to do a lot of other interesting stuff as well. So the enzyme stuff, you're just running it through effectively a biochemical process, whereas with the microorganism, you've got friendly bugs in your bioreactors, and those friendly bugs are going to do a variety of things to your waste products. So degradation and consumption of waste. It can produce the enzymes for the enzyme bioreactors. We can produce edible biomass. It can produce substrates. It can be used to create soil substitutes. It allows us to transform inedible into edible, growing plants. As I mentioned, you can create low weight, short chain hydrocarbons that can be used for fuel. So methane or ethanol can both be created through microorganism bioreactors. So if we can get the bioreactor approach working well, that's really where we're going to be heading. Air filters. We can use microbes to get rid of contaminants in the air. We can cultivate fungi. Again, edible biomass. There will always be mushrooms. Degradation, consumption of waste. Again, this is another process where we are taking waste and we are converting it into useful food or converting it into other useful elements. So the biological techniques are a lot more than extract carbon dioxide, produce oxygen. There's a lot of things we can do with them, especially once we start getting to higher plants. So food, it reclaims water, it reclaims air, it removes air contaminants. This is why we have plants in offices. It helps to get rid of some of the air contaminants. It helps consuming some of the waste. So we will be using a lot of these processes, but we haven't got the balance for them yet. Plant cell cultures. They're doing this on the ISS. They grow their own Chinese cabbage, lettuce, and mizuna. And they are very happy when they get fresh veg on the space station. Interesting things with that are, once you start growing things in orbit like that, you can start doing some really interesting studies on, well, what grows well in orbit? what genetically predisposes a plant to being good in low gravity environments. And once we know what is going to be good in a low gravity environment, we can use that information. We can genetically engineer things that will work. So it's one of these things, it will get larger and larger. We can breed small animals. Yes, mice. Not that we're going to eat mice. But if we were to breed rabbits, rabbits have been suggested as a useful biomass for space stations and indeed lunar Martian bases. It's going to be a while before we take bunnies to Mars, but we may have bunnies on the moon fairly quickly. We can do a lot of stuff with macroalgae. Again, the non-sexy stuff, dealing with waste, is all algae, fungi, bugs. There's a lot of it that we can do. So this is Veggie, the VEG-01 experiment on the ISS, and that large reddish, brownish, greenish thing that really does look like a Doctor Who monster of some sort is actually a lettuce. And in theory, that was not for eating. That was just to see how well they could grow it in situ. But I would be very, very surprised if they hadn't eaten some. And I would be very surprised if NASA had said anything more than, very naughty, don't do it again. And just accepted, yeah, this is going to happen. So if you've got a biological system, it expands our cyclical diagram a bit more. We've still got the carbon dioxide removal and reduction. So we've got the air system, we've got the water system, we've got the waste solid system. But over on the right-hand side, we're now sending everything through to a greenhouse as well. And the greenhouse takes in carbon dioxide, it generates clean air. So it allows us to do a lot of the revitalization in a biological manner. We're still doing all of the same elements, we've got all of the same processes, but some of those processes are being done in a slightly different way. If we're going to do this, and we're going to take it seriously, then really we cannot assume that we can always restock. We can restock the ISS because it's just a case of sending something up to it. It will be more difficult to replenish anything on the moon and forget it in terms of Mars. If you're going to restock Mars, what you're going to restock Mars with is new scientific equipment. You really don't want to have to waste payload weight on food and water. So you're therefore going to look for local resources in order to set up self-sustaining generation for water, for CO2, for soil. We need to have a plant growth substrate of some sort. The interesting question is, will Martian soil do it? Will lunar soil do it? Well, we've seen plants growing on the moon. The Chinese did that last year. I look forward to more of it. What can we do about collection of energy? What can we do about radiation shielding? Because all of these still need to be considered, but we're now looking at, we must be totally self-sufficient in this. Well, I did say we'd talk about potatoes. There has actually been serious work done on potatoes for Mars. It's not just Martian. NASA worked with the International Potato Center in Peru with a particular strain called the LTVR, the lowland tropic virus resistant strain of potatoes, which is a very fast growing one, 90 to 100 days to harvest, and is a really tough, hardy potato. It's drought tolerant, it's high temperature tolerant. Drought tolerant is really important because if water is one of the things that you've got problems acquiring, or something that you're having to be very, very careful with how much you use, you don't want to have to give your food a huge amount of it. They used Atacama desert soil, which has very low nutrient and moisture levels and a high level of oxidizing chemicals. This is really important for Mars because Martian soils appear to have a lot of quite highly oxidizing chemicals in them. So we're not going to be able to use standard strains of potato. We're going to have to be looking at things that are used to really unpleasant desert environments. So of course the Atacama Desert is very, very effective. The final thing that they did with them was they froze potatoes for 9 months. Why on earth freeze for 9 months? 9 months is the most likely transit time for a Mars mission. Now, you don't want to have to grow them for 9 months, although you could, to a certain extent, you might be able to feed your astronauts on potatoes as they travel, but you're more likely to freeze them and then plant them on Mars. And they actually found that this worked perfectly well. They can indeed grow potatoes on Mars, let's call them Mars-like soils, under Mars-like environments. So everyone who thought, potatoes, that's ridiculous, crazy thing about the book or the film. No, actually, the potato is a perfectly valid approach. So if we're looking at the system for instance, a moon base, what else are we going to add to our process? Well, we've got our greenhouse where we can grow our potatoes if we want to, but we've now got lunar nutrients coming in from the lunar nutrient plant. Basically, we're going to pull stuff in from water in the soil. We're going to bring soils in themselves. Whatever we bring in, we're going to have to adjust the nutrient levels within it, and this will probably require bioreactors generating appropriate nutrients. So we're extending the greenhouse concept into nutrient adjuster. We're going to have the microbial regenerator for dealing with waste, but we're also going to have oxygen coming in from working with the lunar regolith and generating oxygen from it. So this is now no longer self-contained in terms of the base itself. What it's doing is it is including nutrients that can be gathered locally. And this is really where we want to go. The true closed-loop self-contained system is only a stepping stone to the final system of being able to use local materials, generating stuff, if you like, restocking or resupplying your base from local materials rather than doing it from materials from Earth, because it's a hell of a lot cheaper if you can get them locally rather than having to pump them up out of the gravity well. So to summarize all of that, life support is a problem. If you use primitive life support, yep, we can do that. And that is basically a case of wherever you go, you just take enough oxygen, food with you. If you like, scuba divers are working with a primitive life support system. They can breathe underwater, but they can only breathe while they've got air in the tank. And when they come back up, you have to stick more air into the tank. The next approach, the more sophisticated approach, is the physiochemical approach. So everything is basic physics and chemistry. The only biological inputs and outputs on that are the crew themselves. But really, we want to go to the advanced approaches, and this is where we're going to use the biological systems. And we can't do it yet. We really do not have the understanding of the ecosystems almost at a molecular level, shall we say, to make this all work. And what we've had to do whenever we've done these things is we've had to restock them with oxygen. We just don't have enough oxygen. So that's going to be our biggie. And generation of oxygen on Mars and on the Moon is going to be the big one that we need to do. And if we can do this local materials for generating oxygen, then planetary bases are going to be a lot easier to do it on than space-based habitats. Okay, bunch of references. As usual, it's predominantly academic type ones. Several from NASA. Scientific American, it was 2016. Scientists try to grow Peruvian potatoes on Mars. That was quite an interesting year.